I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Psychiatric drugs are among the most widely prescribed medications in America. Could diet make a difference? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
This week, we explore the idea that food choices can have a profound impact on mental health. Might a ketogenic diet improve anxiety, depression, or even schizophrenia?
Our guest is a psychiatrist who has used food to change brain chemistry. How does metabolic psychiatry work?
A paleo, keto, or carnivore regimen can reduce insulin resistance in the body and the brain. Might such an approach help you?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how to change your diet and change your mind.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, at the end of summer, respiratory infections overall are less common than in the winter when colds and flu tend to surge. But disease experts are keeping a close eye on COVID-19 levels as they're increasing around the country. For the past several years, there's been a rise in COVID cases late in the summer. It seems likely that this summer will follow that same pattern. California, especially the San Francisco Bay Area and Hawaii, are seeing a particularly sharp increases. But wastewater surveillance suggests that cases are probably growing nearly everywhere in the country. As youngsters head back to school, whether it's kindergarten or college or something in between, they may well encounter infections and potentially bring them home to share with family members.
Infectious disease specialists note that many people now have some level of immunity to the virus. Consequently, infections are usually less severe than they were at the height of the pandemic. However, the elderly, the very young, and immunocompromised are still at risk for very serious illness if they become infected. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends a COVID vaccination or booster for everyone over 6 months of age. An updated vaccine should be available soon and is expected to be well matched to the dominant virus variant. Keeping people at home when they're ill is also critical to keep the virus from spreading.
Older people living on their own are at risk for undernutrition. That, in turn, is associated with frailty and even cognitive decline. Scientists wondered whether they could take a food is medicine approach to this problem. They tested a protein-enhanced Mediterranean diet because older people generally need more protein, with and without an additional exercise program. The study was conducted in Northern Ireland and ran for 6 months. Participants were recruited from the community. Those in the intervention group were encouraged to consume a tablespoon of olive oil and 2 servings of whole grains, fruit, and dairy products daily, along with 3 servings of vegetables. The weekly food targets included 3 servings of nuts, at least 2 servings of chicken and oily fish, and less than 2 servings of red meat. Half of those on the ProMed intervention diet were also prescribed strength, aerobic, and balance exercises tailored to their personal abilities.
Very few of the volunteers actually completed their exercise assignments. However, both of the groups on the ProMed dietary regimen improved their cognitive scores significantly more than those in the control group. According to the researchers, the improvement in nutritional status also resulted in better global cognition and executive function.
Questions about the effect of coffee consumption on metabolism now have a few more answers. Finnish researchers have been tracking a cohort of people born in 1966 since their birth. Follow-up data has been collected when they were 1, 14, 31, and 46 years old. At the 46-year checkup, scientists collected information on background, lifestyle, and health. They also conducted clinical examinations, measured blood pressure, assessed glucose tolerance, and drew blood. The final analysis included more than 2,200 participants, of whom only 70 did not drink coffee. People who habitually drank more coffee had lower proportions of body fat, although BMI was similar. Men who drank more coffee had lower fasting insulin and lower insulin resistance. They also had higher total and bioavailable testosterone.
Doctors get nervous if people stop taking a statin-type cholesterol-lowering drug. That's because they worry that such discontinuation might result in a heart attack or some other cardiovascular complication. A new article in the Lancet journal, Healthy Longevity, compared older patients who continued taking statins with a group that discontinued such drugs. None of these patients had heart disease. After 3 years, there was no difference in mortality between the two groups. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. This week, we'll be talking about the effects of food on mental health. Last week, we spoke with Dr. Will Bulsiewicz about the benefits of a plant-based, fiber-rich diet.
This week's guest takes a completely different approach. We recognize that you may experience whiplash, but we think it's important to provide you with a variety of perspectives and the evidence to support them.
To learn more about how food impacts our mental health, we turn to Dr. Georgia Ede. She's an expert in nutritional and metabolic psychiatry. At Smith College and Harvard University Health Services, she was the first to offer students nutrition-based approaches as an alternative to psychiatric medication. Dr. Ede is the author of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Georgia Ede.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Dr. Ede, we live in unbelievably stressful times. Of course, everybody says that about where they are in the general continuum of life, but we track medications very carefully. And at last count, we added up 50 million people on antidepressants, 8 million people taking anti-anxiety drugs, and about 5 million now on antipsychotic medications. And that does not include the people who are taking drugs for PTSD, ADHD, OCD, bipolar disorders. So most of your colleagues, when they think of mental challenges, they think medications. Diet doesn't usually come into the conversation. And I guess we'd like to know what made you think that diet is an important contributor and how it has changed your practice.
I was just as surprised as most people listening to this interview might be that diet had as much to do with mental health as it does. I mean, I really didn't understand what a critical part it plays in brain health and therefore in mental health. So when I was training to become a psychiatrist back in the 90s, back before the turn of the century now, we didn't learn anything about the relationship between food and brain health or mental health. And so what really woke me up to the importance of food and mental health was really through my own selfish exploration of trying to help myself with some pretty common health problems that were cropping up for me in my early 40s, things that a lot of my own patients were struggling with. And it was really through my own experimentation with nutrition and then subsequently learning about nutrition science that I became aware of how important it is.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. So when I was in my early 40s, I exercised regularly. I was running multiple times per week, lifting weights, going to the gym. And, most of that I was doing to control my weight. I had a weight problem since I was a little girl. Runs in my family, problems with weight management. So And so I consider myself pretty healthy. I ate what I thought was a pretty healthy diet. It was a relatively low fat, calorie controlled diet, high in fiber. I ate very little in the way of processed foods. Most people thought of my diet as relatively healthy. But then in my early 40s, I started developing things like chronic pain and chronic fatigue and IBS and fibromyalgia and migraines. And it was becoming difficult to get through a full work week. So I was working at Harvard University at the time at the Student Mental Health Center. And so I had access to all kinds of wonderful Harvard specialists. And these are very caring and intelligent people. I went to 4 or 5 different specialists, including gastroenterologists, neurologists, et cetera. And nobody could find anything wrong. So I was left to my own devices to figure out what I was going to do. And so because one of the issues was IBS, I thought, well, maybe something I'm eating is bothering my stomach. Maybe I could at least see if I could do something about that. So I started keeping a food and symptom journal and trying to figure out if there was any relationship between what I was eating and when I was getting stomach pain, for example. And so long story short, after about 6 months of trial and error, I arrived at this kind of unorthodox, almost upside down diet that resolved all of the symptoms I was having, not just the gastrointestinal symptoms, but also the migraines, the fatigue, et cetera. Everything was gone. And what really got my attention as a psychiatrist was my mental health was so much better. Even though that wasn't one of my goals, I didn't even think of my mental health as something that needed attention. So my mood, my energy, my concentration, my stamina, my sleep, all noticeably better. So I thought, this diet seems to be good for the brain. And maybe principles in this, if I can understand why this diet is helping me, maybe it could help some of my patients as well.
Dr. Reed, you say you arrived at an upside down diet. What does that look like?
Well, we're told that we're supposed to, eat a plant-forward diet that's high in fiber and that's low in red meat and low in saturated fat. And this diet really was the opposite of that. So this diet was high in cholesterol, higher in saturated fat, or at least higher in animal fat. Let me put it that way. Higher in animal fat, higher in animal protein, and lower in fiber, much lower in fiber than most diets, and was relatively low in plant foods. And so it really was the opposite of how I had been eating for many years.
And yet it made you feel better.
So much better. I mean, I felt better than I'd felt in my entire life. Even going back to childhood, I couldn't remember ever feeling that good.
Well, we have just spoken recently with Dr. Bulsiewicz, who is one of the country's foremost leaders when it comes to fiber. He's a gastroenterologist. He loves fiber. But we've also talked with Dr. Eric Westman at Duke University. Dr. Westman is about 5 minutes from this studio that we're talking to you from. And Dr. Westman's story is quite similar to yours. Patients would come to him and ask him, what about this other diet? And in those days, it was the
Atkins diet.
Atkins diet. And he said, oh, no, that's not very good. But then he actually started doing research and he said, oh, my goodness, it's working for these patients. What in the world is metabolic psychiatry, which is kind of what you are now practicing? And why do you think you and Dr. Eric Westman found a more, we'll call it the ketogenic diet, and we'll ask you what that means, why it would have such a profound impact on the brain?
Yes, I know Dr. Eric Westman quite well, and we've collaborated on a couple of papers, and I really admire his work. He has been researching metabolism and physical health, particularly obesity and type 2 diabetes, for many years. He's one of the pioneers in the field. But what's really interesting about Dr. Westman's work is he published the first well-documented case of a person with serious mental illness recovering on a ketogenic diet. So this was in 2009. So he's an internist and an obesity medicine specialist. He's not a psychiatrist. So there was a woman who had come to him. She was in, I believe, her 60s at the time that he saw her. And she came to him to try to lose weight. So he put her on the very same low carbohydrate diet that he puts everybody else on for weight loss. And lo and behold, many of her psychotic symptoms went into remission, and she was able to actually stop all of her psychiatric medications she'd been on for decades. And she lived out the rest of her life without any psychiatric medication.
That's pretty amazing. And did your colleagues pay any attention to it?
I didn't, even myself didn't know about that case until I started researching nutrition science, and nutrition and mental health. And I really began that journey maybe about 15 years ago or so. And so none of my colleagues was aware of, that particular case. And none of my colleagues was aware of ketogenic diets and mental health. There was almost nothing written about it back then.
Well, speaking of your colleagues, I mean, most psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical social workers think about two approaches to mental health from their professional perspective. One, psychotherapy, which can be quite helpful, and two, medications. We just have about a minute and a half before the break. The medications have not been as effective as most people imagine. How effective are antidepressants, for example, when it comes to actually alleviating depression?
According to the best studies available, if we're being generous, they work about 10% better than placebo on average for major depressive disorder.
Suggesting that a lot of people don't get help.
Most people do not get better with antidepressants. More than half of people do not respond to even 2 or 3 trials of antidepressants.
And antipsychotic medications may calm some of the symptoms, but they don't make the psychosis go away. They're not like cures.
They don't address the root causes of the psychosis, which we've not understood very well until recently. We've got some new clues about what might be going on underneath.
So in the 30 seconds before the break, how well does diet work, and is there any science to support your approach?
There's now an explosion of research in what's called metabolic psychiatry, the cornerstone of which is ketogenic diets, and the research is very promising. We've got some randomized controlled trials coming out more and more all the time, so I guess we can come back to that later, but yes, the science is very promising.
You're listening to Dr. Georgia Ede, a psychiatrist who utilizes nutrition in treating patients' mental illness. Dr. Ede co-authored the first inpatient study of a ketogenic diet for treatment-resistant mental illness. Her new book is Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health.
After the break, we'll learn about the neurochemistry of food and its impact on the brain.
Brains use a lot of energy. What's wrong with sugar as a source of energy?
You'll hear about a person who was walking 25 miles a day to ease his anxiety. A ketogenic diet made a big difference for him.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by ButcherBox.
Have you ever wondered what's for dinner and felt like there might not be a great answer to that question? With ButcherBox, there is an answer. The freezer is stocked with delicious options that are just waiting for your culinary creativity.
ButcherBox provides you with healthy protein options that are environmentally friendly. We've enjoyed salmon and ground bison, scallops, and steak.
It's easier to follow a healthful diet when you have top-quality ingredients at your fingertips. I love cooking what ButcherBox provides from the choices I make when I order.
ButcherBox delivers 100% grass-fed beef, organic chicken, wild-caught seafood, and more, all sourced to standards they can actually tell you about. They've already done the research and made the tough sourcing decisions, so all you have to do is decide What's for dinner?
If you're looking for an easier way to get great meals on the table, give ButcherBox a try. Go to butcherbox.com/PPOD to get $20 off your first box, plus your choice of free ground beef for life or free chicken thighs or top sirloins in every box for a year, with free shipping always. That's butcherbox.com/PPOD. Again, that's butcherbox.com/PPOD. Be sure to use our link so they know we sent you.
That refresh you've been putting off until the right deal came along? It's here! Wayfair's Black Friday and July sale is happening now, so you can finally get the style you've been waiting for less. Get up to 80% off area rugs and up to 60% off outdoor and bedroom furniture. Shop Wayfair's huge selection of styles and find the piece to fit your style, budget, and space. Plus, free shipping. Black Friday in July ends July 27th. Shop today at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Sonu, an FDA-approved drug-free treatment for nasal congestion and runny nose, using sound instead of steroids. More at getsonu.com. That's getsonu.com.
And by Spatial Sleep, a non-drug approach to help you fall asleep and stay asleep without medications. More information at spatialsleep.com.
We're talking about how a ketogenic diet could benefit our mental health.
Dr. Eads suggests that metabolic flexibility is a benefit. That's the ability to use either sugar or ketones for fuel.
We're talking today with Dr. Georgia Eade, a psychiatrist who advocates for using nutritional and metabolic psychiatry in treating patients. She's a recipient of the Bulsiewicz Brain Research Fund's first annual Metabolic Mind Award. Her new book is Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health.
Dr. Eade, in your wonderful book, you have laid out in great detail the neurochemistry of how food affects our brains. Can you give us an overview, please?
In a nutshell, if we want our brains to be healthy, they need to be nourished, they need to be protected, and they need to be energized. So they need to be nourished. That means that your diet should provide adequate amounts of all essential nutrients. They need to be protected from damage. So your diet needs to exclude or minimize ingredients that can damage the brain. And they need to be energized, which means this is largely about metabolic health, your metabolism, your glucose and insulin levels, and whether or not your brain has access to ketones for energy. So those three principles are really powerful levers that people can pull using their diet to improve their fundamental brain health.
Well, let's get very specific. You talk a bit about how sugar, and in particular glucose, affects the brain. And there was some research just recently about glucosamine, a dietary supplement that people take for arthritis, and how it affects something called glycosylation. So we won't go too far into the weeds, but can you help us understand what's going on in the brain when it comes to energy?
Yes. So, and glycosylation is a great place to start because if your blood sugar levels, if your blood glucose levels are running too high too often, which is now the case for the majority of Americans, even if their fasting morning blood glucose is normal, and that's the one you'll get checked at the doctor's visit, your glucose level after meals is likely higher than it should be. Which means, so if your glucose level in the blood is running too high too often, then so will your brain glucose level be running too high too often, because the higher the blood glucose, the higher the brain glucose. And the brain does need some glucose at all times to function at its best, but it doesn't need very much. And if it gets more than it needs, that extra glucose will literally stick. That's what's called glycosylation. It will stick to all kinds of important molecules and structures throughout the brain. and you can think of it as caramelizing all of the fundamental components of the brain, turning them into these kind of sticky, dysfunctional clusters called advanced glycation end products. And those clusters set off waves of inflammation and what's called oxidative stress in the brain that can be very damaging and can destabilize your brain chemistry as well.
So I understand that the brain needs energy. I mean, you don't think of it like a muscle, which is so obvious. If you're going to run for half a mile, you're going to be using up energy. And your brain, it just seems to be sitting there inside your skull, not doing anything. But in reality, it's doing an awful lot, and it requires 20% of the energy that we utilize in our bodies. And it gets that energy from two places. Tell us about it.
The most important molecules the brain uses for energy are glucose and ketones. So most people think of glucose as the brain's ideal sort of preferred energy source. And if they think about ketones at all, they might think about them as just an emergency backup fuel for dire circumstances. But that's actually not the way we evolved. We evolved to switch back and forth between a mostly glucose-based energy system, and a mix of fuels, meaning glucose and fat or ketones. Ketones are just small, ready-to-burn fragments of fat that can cross into the brain and energize cells. So the brain, as you very nicely described, it is an energy hog. It uses 10 times more energy than you'd expect for an organ of its size because it's an electrical organ. So that energy supply is critical to all aspects of brain function.
Dr. Eid, I wonder, you started your book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, with a story about Carl, and I wonder if you would share that with us right now.
Yes, and Carl has allowed us to talk about his story. He was 65 years old when he first consulted with me. He was a salesman and an avid cycler. He biked 100 miles or more every week. So despite having eaten a standard American diet his entire life, he was actually lean and physically fit. So you wouldn't think of him as metabolically unhealthy. And he'd been dealing with mood and attention problems for as long as he could remember. And years before we met, he'd gone to a specialty psychiatric clinic for brain imaging and some other specialized testing. And he walked out thousands of dollars later with 3 diagnoses: major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and ADHD, and 3 prescriptions, 1 for each disorder. And those medications triggered the first manic episode of his life, nearly destroying his marriage and his career. And it left him understandably afraid to take medicines ever again. So he decided to stop the medications and let rigorous exercise be his medicine. And it did make a big difference for a long time. It wasn't completely helpful, but it was very helpful. But as he got older, depression and anxiety began to creep back into his life. And then something stressful happened at work, and it set off this 3-month episode of restlessness and insomnia. So he decided to consult with me because his exercise plan had become so time-consuming that it was unsustainable. So, for example, on days when conditions weren't right for him to be able to bicycle, he would have to walk between 8 and 25 miles at a time to try to calm himself down. And so he also was losing weight, and he couldn't afford to. By the time he saw me, he was 10 pounds underweight.
And so I can well imagine that walking 25 miles in a day, that's going to take up a lot of your day, not to mention a lot of your energy.
Yes. And so he was, at his wit's end. And so, he scored 15 out of 27 on a PHQ-9 depression questionnaire. His anxiety score very high, 17 out of 21 on a screening test for anxiety. So he contacted me. We discussed various different diets that he could try. He had read from a different physician online about carnivore diets. So he wanted to try that. He was under the impression that would give him the fastest relief. So within a few days, he was in mild ketosis every day by urine testing. Just meant that he had some measurable levels of ketones in his system. And he started feeling better within just a couple of weeks. And by 6 weeks, which is when I always retest the using the questionnaires, his scores on both the anxiety and the depression tests were 0.
Zero?
Zero.
That's astonishing.
It is. You don't see results like this in conventional psychiatric care. It's very, very it was very surprising to me. I don't see results like this every day using nutrition and metabolic psychiatry, but I see them often enough that it really gets my attention.
And was it
These approaches
sustainable?
are root cause approaches.
Was it
He is
sustainable?
still to this day. So what he did was, after a couple of months of feeling really excellent, we broadened his diet, first of all, to help him gain some weight, because believe it or not, even though he was eating an unrestricted carnivore diet, meaning he was eating 3 to 4 pounds of fatty meat per day, he could not regain that 10 pounds that he'd lost. So we added back in some carbohydrate from whole foods, the foods that he missed the most, which turned out to be starchy root vegetables and yogurt. And that's the plan that he follows even now. This is years later. And I keep in touch with him. He's still doing very, very well. So this is an example of how you can, personalize dietary strategies for people's circumstances.
Now, Dr. Reed, you mentioned that fairly soon after he started on this carnivore diet, he went into ketosis. And I think a lot of people hear a word like ketosis and think, oh my goodness, isn't that dangerous? So please explain to us, ketosis, is it dangerous? And what is it?
Right. So in medical school, the only time I'd ever heard the word ketone was in the context of something called ketoacidosis, which is a medical emergency, life-threatening medical. So there are a lot of physicians who still confuse those two terms. So ketosis just means that you are burning fat for energy, so that you're using a mixture of fuels. You're using a mixture of glucose and ketones. So when you burn fat, if you're burning fat vigorously enough, your liver will chop some of that fat into fragments called ketones, which dissolve in the blood and can feed many cells throughout the brain and body, and in combination with glucose. You don't stop using glucose. You're now using just a mixture. It's like a hybrid engine. So going into ketosis just means you're burning more fat for energy than you usually are. And most people want to be burning more fat for energy, don't they?
Can you explain the ketogenic diet for people who perhaps have been living in a cave for the last 10 years and have no idea what you're talking about?
Of course, if they've been living in a cave, they might have been following a ketogenic diet. Who knows?
This is the medical anthropologist. Yes, exactly. So, right. So many people think of the ketogenic diet as a weight loss diet, but it was actually originally designed back in 1921, over 100 years ago, to stabilize brain chemistry, to try to control seizures in children with severe epilepsy, which it actually does a relatively good job of. And so, so the ketogenic diet it's a very low carbohydrate diet that's moderate in protein, not high in protein, but moderate in protein. And then the remainder of the calories come from fat instead of carbohydrate. So it's a low carbohydrate, moderate protein, high fat diet.
Now, Dr. Reed, the ketogenic diet is not the only diet that you write about in Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. You also mention a paleo diet, and you mention a carnivore diet, which we've already discussed because that's where Carl started his experimentation. Can you explain those to us, please?
Yes, so a paleo diet is the diet that we imagine our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have been eating for the vast majority of our evolutionary history. So for nearly 2 million years, we would have just eaten whole plant and animal foods that were available in our natural environment. So these, things like fruits and vegetables and nuts and eggs and poultry and fish and meat. So a very, very simple whole foods diet. Of course, our diet today is very, very different from this, what we would call paleo diet, whereas more than 60% of what Americans now eat doesn't come from our natural environment. It comes from factories. So it's really wreaking havoc on our mental health, our physical health, our metabolic health.
And out of curiosity, going back to the neurochemistry, when people switch from that American diet or even the American Heart Association preferred diet to a more ketogenic diet, what's going on in the brain and why should it make a difference?
Well, the difference for the brain is profound because what's really happening is you're shifting the brain's energy supply from mostly glucose to a mixture of glucose and ketones. And the reason why that is important is because the majority of us now have, because we've been eating the wrong way and being sedentary and eating lots of processed factory foods for so long, and our glucose levels have been running so high and our insulin levels have been running too high. Many of us have pre-diabetes, if not type 2 diabetes. Many of us are overweight. We have poor metabolic health. And what that means is that if you have pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes or something called insulin resistance, what that means is that your brain is going to have trouble using glucose for energy to full capacity or properly. So your brain is going to struggle to use glucose for energy. And that means that you're going to need a supplemental fuel source. And that's where ketones really shine because they can cross the blood-brain barrier, enter the brain, and bridge any energy gaps there might be. So as we've damaged our metabolism, our glucose metabolism, we've also been damaging our brain metabolism. And ketones can really be a godsend in those cases.
Dr. Eid, I think some of our listeners will find this a familiar idea because of a video that went viral several years ago in which a woman said, "Oh, my husband has Alzheimer's disease and I fed him coconut oil and that cured his Alzheimer's disease." Now, first of all, I think we have no evidence that coconut oil will cure Alzheimer's disease. But the idea that you could get any kind of brain benefit from just eating oil, tell us about that idea.
So that was Dr. Mary Newport, who was using that approach to help her husband. A really remarkable case. And so I don't use that particular approach in my work. I use ketogenic diets to raise ketone levels rather than just adding coconut oil. But the principle is very similar. Basically, you want to encourage the brain to use more fat for energy and rely less on glucose because especially in the case of Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease. And nearly 20 years ago, researchers at Brown University started referring to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes because the problems with glucose and insulin utilization in the brain were so profound in so many cases that they viewed it as a metabolic disorder. And so if you can help the brain rely less on glucose because those pathways are damaged and rely more on fat, that can wake cells up in the brain that have been struggling to get enough energy for a long time.
Dr. Eid, we just have a minute before the break. I'm curious, you've now seen many patients over many years. What kinds of conditions benefit from a ketogenic diet?
Well, I have yet to see a diagnosis that is not worth trying a ketogenic diet for. I like to say that the diagnosis really doesn't matter because what we're dealing with is brain disorders and poor brain health. And the ketogenic diet, if it's properly constructed and safely supervised, improves multiple aspects of brain health and therefore makes sense to consider almost no matter what the issue is, with the possible exception of underweight anorexia nervosa. And so there's research now, case reports, clinical trials, including some randomized control trials now, demonstrating that it has the potential to help a wide variety of psychiatric disorders.
You're listening to Dr. Georgia Eid, a psychiatrist who utilizes nutrition in treating patients' mental illness. Dr. Eid co-authored the first inpatient study of a ketogenic diet for treatment-resistant mental illness. Her new book is Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind.
After the break, we'll get more information on the many different types of conditions that might benefit from trying a ketogenic diet.
Paleo and keto diets are popular online. Why does Dr. Eid insist that either approach should be medically supervised instead of a do-it-yourself project?
For one thing, 50 million Americans are on antidepressants. Stopping such a drug without help from the prescriber can result in really serious withdrawal symptoms.
Why does Dr. Eid recommend starting with a quiet paleo diet first before jumping into a full ketogenic eating plan?
Evidence-based medicine requires clinical trials. We'll hear about a big trial in Australia treating people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder by modifying their diets.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Instant Hydration.
You've probably heard us emphasize the importance of staying well hydrated. That's crucial for keeping your kidneys functioning well, and it's important for all our other systems as well.
You might need more than plain water, especially during the hot weather we've been suffering through this summer. If you're sweating a lot, you need to replace your electrolytes, and we can't think of a better way to do that than instant hydration.
Each packet contains potassium and magnesium, as well as sodium. That's really important. Often, we don't get enough of those vital minerals.
Even better, instant hydration does not have sugar, so what you get is just good-tasting rehydration with minerals. No sugar, no glucose spike.
It gets its sodium from French gray sea salt, a really prime source.
We think you'll be as enthusiastic as we are about instant hydration, so don't go through another horribly hot week without it.
For a better way to stay hydrated, go to instanthydration.com/PPOD and use the promo code PPOD for over 40% off your first subscription order. It's Instant Hydration's best offer available. That's instanthydration.com/PPOD. That promo code, PPOD.
One thing I've noticed about Azure Standard is that it changes how you think about your home. Instead of running out for one thing at a time, you start thinking about abundance. A well-stocked pantry, a thriving garden, meals shared with family. It's a different approach to living. Explore what Azure Standard has to offer at azurestandard.com and shop this month's Waves of Abundance deals. Azure Standard, family-owned and operated. Shop today at azurestandard.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Sonu, an FDA-approved drug-free treatment for nasal congestion and runny nose, using sound instead of steroids this allergy season. More information at getsonu.com.
Today, we're discussing the effect of a ketogenic diet on mental health. This dietary advice is quite different from the recommendations you heard here last week when we discussed the health benefits of fiber. Humans can be flexible in choosing diets that support good health. We would like to emphasize our guest's recommendation that any significant dietary changes be made under medical supervision so that prescriptions can be adjusted if necessary.
We are talking with Dr. Georgia Eid, a psychiatrist who utilizes nutrition in treating patients' mental illness. Dr. Eid co-authored the first inpatient study of a ketogenic diet for treatment-resistant mental illness. Her new book is Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health.
Dr. Eid, you've mentioned that you have found many different diagnoses responding to diet, but you mentioned in passing that all of these diets require supervision, and I'd really like you to get into that a bit more. I do worry about people with eating disorders being treated or trying to treat themselves with diet. And I actually am concerned about lots of people trying this as a do-it-yourself, at-home project. It's not that kind of thing, is it?
No, thank you. The ketogenic diet is a really powerful metabolic intervention. It can change blood glucose levels, blood pressure levels, medication side effects very quickly. Now, you want a powerful intervention, but it needs to be medically supervised. And the reason for that is because, let's say, for example, you're taking a medication for to keep your blood glucose under control. So that medication is designed to lower your blood sugar. Now you start a diet, which also very effectively lowers your blood sugar. Now you've got two interventions lowering your blood sugar, and you could very quickly, within 24 hours, find yourself in dangerous hypoglycemia territory.
That's very low blood sugar.
Very low blood sugar. So dangerously low blood sugar. So that's just one example. But it can also, medications of all kinds, psychiatric medications, blood pressure medications, heart medications, all need to be very closely supervised. And medical conditions need to be very closely supervised, especially during that transition, the early weeks of a ketogenic diet, as your cells are changing operating systems, essentially.
Well, I'm curious about antidepressants in particular, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, 50 million Americans are currently taking an antidepressant type drug, and we don't want any of them stopping their medicine suddenly because that could produce some really unpleasant withdrawal reactions. So if you were to describe a typical patient who's been dealing with depression for years and you wanted to introduce a ketogenic diet, how would you do that?
So the neuropharmacologist in you was coming out, and this is really important because these medications, if you stop them abruptly, or if you lower the dose too quickly, you can not just have uncomfortable reactions, you could even have potentially dangerous reactions, withdrawal effects from those medications. So they must be very slowly and carefully tapered. So if I were going to start, which I do all the time, if we're going to start a ketogenic diet in somebody who's already taking medications, and this is actually almost always the way it's done, by the way, the ketogenic diet is not an either-or approach. It's almost always done in combination with other treatments. So if someone's taking medication and they're in psychotherapy, we don't stop the medication and the psychotherapy. We add the ketogenic diet to those treatments, and then we take things one step at a time after that to see whether can we lower the medications over time or not. So it's a very personalized and very careful and gradual approach.
And how long does it take for a ketogenic type diet to begin to produce clinical results?
The answer I like to give is 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. Some people respond within a few days. Most people respond within a few weeks. And then there are some people who need to wait 3 or even 4 months for benefits to be truly noticeable. But in most cases, it's much quicker than you might think.
Dr. Eid, you do suggest in Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind that people begin with something you call a quiet paleo diet before they jump into a full ketogenic diet. Can you tell us why?
Yes, because if you go from a diet that's a typical diet contains hundreds of grams of carbohydrate, and so insulin levels tend to run high. And if you switch from that to a standard ketogenic diet, which typically will include less than 50, usually closer to 20 grams of carbohydrate per day, that is a dramatic drop in glucose and insulin levels overnight. And that can be a huge shock to the brain and body. And it can be very uncomfortable and even dangerous. So you want to ease your way on to these diets, and then it'll be a lot more comfortable. So in the book, what I recommend is that people start with as you mentioned, kind of a quiet paleo diet. This is a paleo diet, which we already mentioned before, but it's lower in carbohydrate than a standard paleo diet, which doesn't limit carbohydrate. So I say, about 90 grams of carbohydrate per day, about 30 per meal, to gradually lower those glucose and insulin levels. Another way you could do it is you could just start with one meal at a time. So you switch breakfast over to ketogenic for a while, then you add a ketogenic lunch, and then eventually dinner. And that approach can also be very supportive of a more gradual transition.
Well, I wonder if you could tell us about another patient, and perhaps you could tell us about Maria. What was her situation, and how did you treat her?
Yes. So Maria she was the first person that I ever used a low carbohydrate approach with. It was when I was working at the Harvard University Health Services. So she was a 31-year-old Mexican-American postdoc student requesting help with frequent panic attacks. So she enjoyed running and hiking, so she was lean, she was physically fit. She described herself as health conscious, and she came to me because she was hoping to avoid medication for panic attacks. So I took a more detailed history, looking for patterns that might help me understand whether there might be connections between her symptoms and her meals, the composition and timing of her meals. So in addition to experiencing these multiple panic attacks per week, she was also reporting constant food cravings, irritability if she went too long between meals, feeling sleepy 2 hours after meals, and what she described as a pattern of emotional eating. And all of those suggest something with the diet may be playing a role.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked her to give examples of what she would eat on a typical day. And she said breakfast, she would eat toast with peanut butter, coffee with skim milk. Lunch would be like tuna salad, cheese, piece of bread. Dinner might be pasta with cheese. She would snack on fruit like bananas and yogurt. Her diet was actually simpler and lower in ultra-processed foods and added sugar than most diets that I've seen in my career.
She was health conscious, in fact.
She was very health conscious, and so much healthier than most students that I saw. But you notice she was eating foods that contained flour at every meal. So it was still relatively high in refined carbohydrates because flour is just sugar in disguise. Flour is about 75% starch. It breaks down rapidly into glucose in the bloodstream. It really is just sugar. So I told her that it's possible that she might be sensitive to carbohydrate, and would she be open to trying a whole foods low carbohydrate experiment? So she changed her diet. So for breakfast, she would have 2 eggs with butter and guacamole. For lunch and dinner, she'd have meat and non-starchy vegetables. And snacking, she would use nuts and cheese. And within a couple of weeks, her symptoms were 90% gone. And so when that occurred for this young woman, it was really a wonderful kind of test of these principles in real life clinical practice that really inspired me to keep going in this direction.
Dr. Eid, a lot of your colleagues, psychiatrists, cardiologists, other physicians, just can't wrap their heads around what you're describing because medications are their go-to solution for, I don't care if it's panic or anxiety or depression or psychosis. And the idea that a diet might make a difference in someone's mental health, it's not something they learned in medical school or in their, specialty training. They want science. I'll only believe it if I can see it in a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And that's kind of hard sometimes when it comes to dietary approaches. So tell us about the scientific evidence and how your colleagues are dealing with what you're describing.
Well, the science in this area is really growing rapidly. And so we now have multiple case reports, multiple uncontrolled clinical trials, observational studies, and now even randomized control trials are starting to be published in this field. This is a very exciting emerging subspecialty in psychiatry with a lot of interest. And so my colleagues around the world are going to start to hear about these clinical trials. And I predict that within the next couple of years, it's going to be impossible to ignore the science because we've got a large randomized control trial that's going to be coming out in the next few months from James Cook University in Australia, using very carefully medically supervised ketogenic diets in people with chronic mental illness, especially schizophrenia and bipolar disorders.
Whoa.
We will really look forward to that.
Schizophrenia is considered a lifelong condition that's virtually uncurable, and that at best you can do is control some of those challenging thoughts and emotions. How well does a ketogenic diet work for something so serious?
Well, the randomized controlled trial evidence we are waiting for. But I can tell you that I helped publish a study in 2022, which was not a randomized control trial, but was the clinician who did the clinical work was Dr. Albert Donat, who is a psychiatrist practicing in Toulouse, France, who had been psychiatrist for more than 35 years now. And he invited 33 of his most treatment-resistant patients with severe major depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia to try a whole foods, mildly ketogenic diet in the hospital under his supervision. And these were people who had been ill for an average of 10 years, some for as long as 30 years, and they were taking an average of 5 psychiatric medications when they came into the hospital.
Whoa.
And yes, and this is not at all unusual. I mean, it's very common for people with chronic mental illnesses to be taking 5 or more psychiatric medications, because the psychiatric medications, although they can be very helpful, I want to emphasize that I still use them in my work, but they do not work as well as we need them to. And they have multiple serious side effects. So they came into the hospital and they tried this diet, and 31 of those patients were able to stay on the ketogenic diet for 2 weeks or longer, which is what you need to do to start to see results in many cases. And 43% of them achieved clinical remission from their primary psychiatric diagnosis, and 64% of them left the hospital on less psychiatric medication.
That's very impressive. As Joe would point out, it isn't a randomized controlled trial, but it certainly is impressive. I would also like to ask you to share one more story, if you would, please, and then we
Sure.
have a few more questions.
Absolutely.
Tell us about Fran. She was having memory problems.
Oh yes, Fran. Fran's wonderful. So she's a retired registered dietitian. She was in her mid-60s when she first consulted with me, and about 20 years before that, when she was in her mid-40s, she'd slipped on the ice, sustained a concussion and a neck injury, and developed seizures as a consequence of the head injury. And she started struggling to remember things. So like she'd forget, dates of important events like upcoming family weddings. She would hunt for hours for her car in parking lots. She would get lost driving to work meetings. So she was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, which you can think of as kind of pre-Alzheimer's. And she was prescribed lamotrigine or Lamictal, which is an anticonvulsant medication for the seizures. And so her cognitive abilities appeared to hold steady until her 60s. And then she began noticing a bit more difficulty with memory and occasional trouble finding her words. But they were too subtle, really, for her primary care doctor to notice, but on a screening test. But then at age 67, something really scary happened, which was after sewing for a lifetime, she could no longer figure out how to thread her sewing machine. And she was sitting talking with her son in the living room, and she would lose her train of thought, and she couldn't finish her sentences, and she was scared to death. So her primary care scheduled her to see a neurologist for further testing, and basically said, "You're developing Alzheimer's disease." He conducted a cognitive test in his office, said, "You're developing Alzheimer's. We knew this was going to happen eventually. I'll have you go see a neurologist, but he doesn't have an appointment for 10 weeks." So in the meantime, she consulted with me, and she started a ketogenic diet. And over time, she improved. And by the time she saw the neurologist 10 weeks later, she scored 27 out of 28 on his cognitive test. And he said, "It's time to take this diagnosis off of your chart."
Dr. Eid, the diets you have described are pretty high in meat, and there are quite a few listeners who are not comfortable eating meat. They are ethically committed to vegetarianism or even veganism. Is there any way to follow a ketogenic diet if you are a vegetarian?
Absolutely. So the ketogenic diet is not a food list, it's macronutrient rules. It's very low carbohydrate, it's moderate protein, it's high in fat. That protein and fat can come from plants or animals, your choice. And so it's everybody, whether they follow vegan, vegetarian, or omnivorous diet, can get the benefits, the brain healing benefits of ketosis, regardless of their dietary preferences.
Dr. Eid, what would you say to your colleagues who are skeptical about anything dietary? For them, what they've been trained in, what they're comfortable with is, just let me write a prescription for an SSRI or an atypical antipsychotic, or for a child who has attention deficit disorder, a stimulant drug such as Ritalin. How do you begin to introduce your approach to such skeptics?
Right. And so one of the things I spend a lot of my time doing is I teach a CME accredited course to clinicians in ketogenic diets for mental health. And really, and I give lots of presentations to fellow clinicians, including psychiatrists around the world. And really what I emphasize is that you do not need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you have an approach that's helping your patient, but they're not getting better enough, and I would argue that most patients are not getting better enough, it's wonderful to have another tool in the toolbox to augment your existing strategies. And so if you think about the root causes of mental health conditions, which we now understand are not just chemical imbalances in the brain, but also inflammation and oxidative stress and energy, difficulty accessing energy, the ketogenic diet can address those root causes. And then you can use psychotherapy medication in combination with the ketogenic diet if that combination works best. So just to add another tool to the toolbox for your patients who are not getting better enough, which I would argue is most of them.
Well, I'm fascinated that you mentioned the chemical imbalance theory, because for decades, that's what everyone was taught. Oh, your brain is a little off kilter. You've got too little serotonin and maybe not enough dopamine, or too much dopamine and maybe a little bit of norepinephrine that's out of whack. And so what we need to do is retune your brain with these drugs, which will correct the chemical imbalance.
Well, they do retune the brain. They do change the way that the brain responds to these neurotransmitters.
But that has kind of begun to fall by the wayside. The idea that if you just take Prozac, it'll straighten out your serotonin levels and everything will be fine and dandy. Can you give us a little sense of how your approach differs from the brain neurochemistry mistake approach, and how the two might work in concert?
Absolutely. So this could be a whole conversation in itself, but basically, the good news is that to whatever extent chemical imbalances appear in or are playing a role in mental health conditions, which they are in certain cases playing a greater or lesser role depending on the condition we're talking about, it's not that chemical imbalances don't exist in many of these mental health disorders, but the question is what's causing those chemical imbalances in the first place. And one of the many wonderful things that a ketogenic diet can do is help rebalance those very same brain chemicals that we are trying to rebalance with medication. Because one of the many issues with medication approach is that the brain finds a workaround. So if you take a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, for example, like escitalopram or citalopram or paroxetine, that may help for a while, but it's very common in clinical practice to see those medications kind of peter out over time. And that's, we believe, because the brain has found a workaround. It's trying to get back to its previous state of being. It's a natural and normal process. But that's not true when you address the root cause of the chemical imbalance. So what's causing those chemical imbalances in the first place, in many cases, is inflammation and oxidative stress. And so then you have to dig deeper. Okay, what's causing the inflammation and oxidative stress? And in many cases, it's our modern lifestyle, particularly our diet. So if your glucose and insulin levels are running too high too often, you will have, this is very well documented, a more inflammatory environment in the brain and a lot more oxidative stress.
I don't think anyone is going to argue that our standard American diet is good for our mental health. And I think that is actually starting to show up in the medical literature. I found an article last week showing there were 30 or 40 studies that showed together people who were eating processed food were much more prone to anxiety. But I am interested in a couple of details that we found in Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And they are probably just details, but I'm curious about them. You say dairy, you don't include it in your recommended foods to be consumed. Why not?
Right. So in the book, what I do is I say that if you're benefiting from a ketogenic diet that includes dairy, then there's probably no need to make that change. But I don't just study brain metabolism and ketogenic diets. I also study nutrition and food chemistry, and which I find fascinating. And so if we look for, first of all, from an evolutionary perspective, dairy is a relatively new food group that really has just been in existence since we domesticated animals, which wasn't that long ago on the evolutionary scale. So for many, many years, nearly 2 million years, dairy was probably a very small part of our diet. So the problem with dairy is that it is a species-specific growth formula for another mammal, and we were never really intended to see, especially not in our diets every day, and especially not as we emerge into adulthood. So milk is a species-specific growth formula designed for baby mammals, and then those baby mammals are supposed to mature and graduate to solid food. But what we are told in our in nutrition guidelines and elsewhere is that we are supposed to consume dairy as part of our diet for our entire lives, and furthermore, the dairy products from other species. It really doesn't make evolutionary sense. So that's a theoretical argument. But what happens when people eat dairy is often, and the only way to know this is to take it out and see if you feel better, is it can, for a lot of people, be a common culprit in headaches, in joint pain, in weight gain and weight loss plateaus, in inflammation and gastrointestinal issues and skin conditions.
Mm-hmm.
These are some of the most common issues we see. And so because most of us have been eating it every day since we were young, we don't make that connection. So it's pretty easy just to do an experiment. And I encourage people to take it out and see if they feel better. And if they don't notice any difference, they can put it back in.
One last question in that regard, and that is nuts. What's wrong with nuts?
It depends on who you are, right? And so the reason I call attention to nuts is because some people have a devil of a time with nuts, and they're not aware of it. And so because we're told that nuts are good for everyone, we don't stop to personalize that advice. For some people, I mean, nuts are very hard to digest. And for some people, especially if they're salted and roasted, they can be addictive, easy to overeat. And they can be very hard on the gut because they are high in certain natural plant compounds, lectins and anti-nutrients that can be irritating or damaging to the gut lining. And so there's a whole chapter in the book about grains, beans, nuts, and seeds and why what the risks and benefits are of including them in the diet. And really what I was trying to do in the book was give people information about different food groups so that they could make their own choices about what to include and why, and that they would have the information they needed to experiment with their own diets and see which mix of foods works best for them.
If I were to ask you to describe the shopping cart that you would bring home with you, what you put in that shopping cart as a typical ketogenic diet approach, so that our listeners who want to dabble their toes in your approach, your concept of mental health, what would the foods look like?
It would really be, if you're open to eating animal foods, and this includes vegetarians who include eggs. If you're open to including animal foods, should include some animal-sourced food in your cart of your choice. This doesn't have to be red meat. There's no requirement to eat red meat. It could be seafood. It could be poultry. It could be eggs. It could be dairy if you tolerate dairy. If you prefer a vegan diet, it really should probably include some kind of a soy product because, like tofu, because tofu contains the full complement of amino acids. But then, it needs to include some high quality sources of protein of your choice, and then it needs to include high quality fats.
Such as?
These could be, for example, coconut oil, olive oil, avocado oil, but it could also include animal fats like duck fat or beef tallow, that sort of thing. And it should include, to the extent that you can tolerate it based on your carbohydrate threshold, fruits and starchy vegetables. Or if you're doing a ketogenic diet, it would include small amounts of low carbohydrate fruits and non-starchy vegetables, things like asparagus and broccoli and lettuce and cucumbers and mushrooms and things that are very low in carbohydrate. And then you can include nuts if you tolerate them. It can include seeds if you tolerate them, but it essentially looks like a paleo shopping cart, the kind of shopping cart that you would have been able to fill if you had lived, a couple 100,000 years ago and just wandering around in the world, hunting and gathering your food.
Dr. Eid, now that you've been in the trenches for the last decade or so with this new way of thinking about treating mental illness, what would you like to share with our listeners and with your healthcare professional colleagues?
I really want people to know that if they've tried everything or they think they've tried everything and nothing has helped very much, to please not give up hope. That if they're willing to try one more thing, I like to say hope is on the menu. Changing your diet can be a powerful mental health intervention, but you have to know which dietary changes are the right ones to make, and they're not the ones we're used to hearing about.
Dr. Georgia Eid, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
I really appreciate you introducing me to your audience and asking and being interested in this topic. Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Georgia Eid, an internationally recognized expert in nutritional and metabolic psychiatry. Dr. Eid co-authored the first inpatient study of the ketogenic diet for treatment-resistant mental illness, developed the first medically accredited course in ketogenic diets for mental health practitioners, and was named a recipient of the Bulsiewicz Brain Research Fund's first annual Metabolic Mind Award. Dr. Eid is the author of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
Today's show is number 1484. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about this episode. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning. This week's podcast has information on vegetarian choices for a ketogenic diet. How does Dr. Eid respond to skeptical colleagues? She also discusses high-quality fats and explains why dairy products and nuts are not part of her nutritional program.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you could sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast.
If you enjoy the People's Pharmacy podcast, we'd be grateful if you'd write a review of the People's Pharmacy and post it to the podcast platform you prefer. If you find our topics thought-provoking, please share them with your friends.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.